Well, welcome to everyone. Glad you're here. I would now I've really enjoyed my conversations on the phone and now in person with Dick Deasy. He is a charming man with a wealth of involvement in history in the whole area of school reform and partnerships and legislation and all the activities that are happening now. And I'm really interested and excited to hear his presentation, which is kind of going to lay out for us the whole kind of history of school reform. I think he described it as back to Sputnik, right? Yeah. So we'll enjoy that, and there'll be time for questions and comments, and there are microphones on either side, and I hope we'll have a chance to have many questions or comments before we break it at 10:30. So without further ado, let me introduce our guest speaker for today, Dick Deasy. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Let me add my congratulations to those of you who are distinguished music educators. You went through a process to end up with that recognition. And the process, as I understood it, was as daunting as your daily work in the classrooms. So congratulations, and it's a delight for me to be in your presence. I want to also mention that Scott Schuler and I have had a long history of working together, generally in the arts advocacy arena, but also on your music work. And I consider Scott, as you do, one of the real great leaders in the field of music education. I'm looking around to see if Gordon Ombach is here. There he is. I reference Gordon, who lives in your midst here in New Haven, because we've been friends for many years. As I lay out this discussion about school reform, there are moments in it where, in fact, Gordon Ombach was a pivotal figure. I will potentially elaborate on that a bit as we go along, but he offered to come this morning and to check on me. I'll get a report afterward. It'll be, graded, or in the new lingo, I'll have to first establish the standards, the criteria, the learning objectives, and he'll determine whether, in fact, I can come back. But I wanted to recognize Gordon, who is really one of the truly great public educators in the United States. Now retired, sort of, the way I'm retired, sort of. I want to deal with this topic, and I picked up this yellow sheet that you folks, and this afternoon I realized you're going to be addressing in your breakout sessions a series of questions, and I just focused on them because I want to my talk I think will relate to that. The first was, in essence, what do we mean when we say school reform? The big word in there to me was we. And I want to sort of encourage you to think about the we. Is that you? Is that the music field? And is there a distinction between what you personally, your discipline collectively, mean by school reform or want it to mean, and what is in fact the way that word is used these days? Which describes a certain kind of activities going on in school. So I think that's a really critical question for you to ruminate about, and maybe I'll give some background and help. You go through a couple other questions, and then you come to this interesting one. What role could music play in your district's attempt to adjust because of school reform? Well, that seems to me to be another one of them that you might want to think about. And what I want to address for a little bit as I get through the talk is, what do the music educators want to advocate for in the larger picture of school reform, in addition to advocating for your own discipline in the field of music? And I'll draw that distinction a little bit. Well, what I want to do is discuss school reform beginning, not exactly back in Sputnik. Anybody remember Sputnik? Oh, great, there's people as old as I am, almost. Sputnik was when the Russians sent the first into orbit, the first satellite, and launched the whole science revolution. It was in the 50s. And that led to the creation of the National Science Foundation, a lot of other things. So I'm not going to go back that far. But what I do want to do is go back a little bit into the 60s and 70s, because in my view, school reform, as we talk about it, is really in two large phases over about 40, 50 years. The first phase is what I refer to as the era of civil rights. And I want to suggest that that era actually made the most substantial changes in schools, perhaps forever in the public education system, going backward. And there came a pivotal moment in 1983 when a report came out called The Nation at Risk. Anybody familiar with that? Okay. When I was putting this talk together, I was working with an arts organization in Baltimore where I live, and I mentioned to the staff that I was doing this, and I mentioned that I was going to dwell on this 1983. Most of them hadn't been born. And I thought, oh, God. But it is a crucial moment, and in that report, which I'll talk about briefly, are the seeds for what is now called the standards movement. So I divide this into the civil rights era and the standards era, and I want to talk a little bit about that, and I'll try and do this relatively briefly so we can have a dialogue at the end. One of the things that in a larger sense, marked the civil rights era, which I'll elaborate, is the attention to what I think of as the contexts in society in the United States and beyond that had to be dealt with in the 60s and 70s. And I want to elaborate on those contexts, and that reform, that word, by the way, was not much in coinage. I happen to have a career in that. I started teaching in 1963, and toward the end of that era, I was the Assistant State Superintendent of Schools for Maryland. The word reform was not in the general usage. We weren't talking reform. We were talking lots of other things. And reform, as a word, really it falls strongly into the standards era. At least that's my recollection. Be that as it may. What I wanted to look at in the civil rights era are the conditions under which changes had to occur in schools. And I want to make the point that that period treated schools as the solution. That is, schools were seen as the institution in society that could really respond to the great needs that are present in the 60s and 70s. There was positive attitudes towards schools, and schools were seen as what had to be embraced to respond to the change. With the nation at risk, things change. And after the nation at risk, schools are seen as places that have to be whipped into shape and forced to do good. They were seen to be failing. And that is a critical distinction that occurs at that crucial moment. And I want to show that to you. So what I want to do as quickly as I can so we can have some conversation together, I want to first look at this civil rights era and the rise in the civil rights era of the role of the federal government. It comes as a great surprise to people to know that the formal U.S. Department of Education wasn't created until 1980. What preceded it was an Office of Education embedded within another federal agency. So during this civil rights era, there is a rise in the power and importance of the U.S. Department of Education. But I'll come to that. So this is turned off. That's that division I want to talk about. Okay, I want to just look at some conditions for you. By the way, I'm going to do this because toward the end of the talk, I want to say, what are the conditions in society, in the United States and globally, that we need schools to respond to? What are the conditions in society? Because our goal in schools is to prepare young people to deal with the reality of their lives and lives going forward. We want them to be able to have a fulfilled personal life, to be strong, positive contributors to their community, and successes in the various dimensions of society. I mean, there are our goals. So what is the society that we have to prepare them to be part of so that those goals are fulfilled? And other things to me are means toward that. So let's look at. So remember, this was a period of time of great growth in our population, the baby boomers. And there were ups and peaks and valleys to that, which threw into great turmoil. But do you build schools or don't you build schools? And we're now going through a period, as those of you who are in an urban environment, where we're closing schools. So the demographics that affect education should not be overlooked. And that became a very diverse culturally and linguistically. Some of you are in districts that have 20, 30, 50, 200 languages being spoken. These conditions didn't go away. The suburbanization, out-migration, white flight, but other forms of out-migration triggered by federal support for the veterans to go back in the suburbs. So we had an exodus of significance from urban areas. There were social and cultural. Some of us lived through this. Some of us didn't. That is to say, there were struggles here. Look. Cultural movements epitomized in the hippie movement, but they were much wider. And civil rights. We'll come back to that in specific ways. Very strong advances in science that challenged the science community, and is that still a factor? Huh? The advances in science, everybody knows, within the past 20 years are the greatest in history. Assassinations. These are factors, Watergate, that really began to create that doubt about whether government's on our side. And that attitude has transmogrified, in my view, to a general question about government in the society, now in different ways, but that began with Vietnam, with Watergate. Can you trust the government? And as you know, new expressions of music, classical and popular. I'm helping design a high school in Cleveland, and two of my co-advisors, one works at Electronic Arts, and the other has worked at Disney. And I was telling them about this, and they said, hey, why don't we build a succession of the music over this 40-year period, because the popular music, so you could play that. I said, well, I think I don't have to do that, but I don't have time. But they said, no, if you would just play excerpts from the progression in popular music and in jazz over that period, it would speak itself to the transformations in the society outside. Because, in fact, popular music, and to extent jazz, embraces and, in fact, is an expression of the conditions going on in society at the time. I mean, hip-hop now, huh? Elvis years ago. So I thought it was an interesting thing and something for you to reflect on. And then there were the economic factors, and I'm going to dwell on this a bit. At that period of time, Japan was looming as the great challenge to the United States. And so I think Gordon may have gone, and I went to Japan on behalf of the Council of Chief State School Officers to check it out, because the notion was, God, we got to do what the Japanese are doing, or we're going to hell in a handbasket, and our economy is going to be bad. So Japan, well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Because now it's China and India. But then the fear of God was present because of what was going on in Japan. Well, and it was also the beginning of the rise of the technologies that now just permeate everything that we do. And that led to the challenge about what would a person need to know and be able to do in their careers going forward, because there were going to be great global challenges, and there were going to be new technologies. And what did we have to do to make sure that young people were going to be up to speed on that? And remember, some of you, then in the 70s, the country was hit with a very bad recession, depression, that's referred to recently because of the new one. And they always go back to that period in the 70s that was comparable. Well, what some of you know is arts education was wiped out during that period. And in some states it was completely wiped out. I mean, California is an example. We have never recovered from that. If there was a golden age in arts education, music education, it was before that point. And I think if there was a golden age, it was probably in the 50s. But after the 70s, we lost so many of you from classrooms, and it's never been fully restored. So that was really a bad moment for the arts. Well, then look what the responses were. That's what I want to point out in this, what I'm calling the era of civil rights. Remember in 1954, that was the court decision that you couldn't have segregated schools. Well, Lyndon Johnson then, when he succeeds Kennedy, when he's killed, passes the Civil Rights Law, which is, as everybody knows, the fundamental law benchmark that attempts to deal with racism in American society. And then Johnson goes on to create what we now have as the federal education law. It's the same law we've now had. It's the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965. I think, Gordon, you were involved at the Office of Education when that was being put together. That law was, and still should be, a response to the kinds of social conditions. And particularly that law was looking at poverty and the effects of racism and other factors. And so its thrust was to deal with those students who were disadvantaged in the society. And that's been the purpose of that law, to respond to them. But then notice, and that's Title I, by the way, everybody knows it's Title I. It was and is still the largest portion of the budget for the U.S. Department of Education. One of the byproducts of that, by the way, in these other programs is that began to strengthen state departments of education because a lot of employees were hired into the department to manage the federal dollars. So a twin thing begins to happen here: the rise of the federal role and the strengthening of the state capacity. The states always had a legal role. It's constitutional that the states run education. They've not always had the capacity, that is, the human beings, to do that. So a twin thing begins to happen here, which, if you think forward to where you are right now, the role of the federal and the state in your lives is quite profound. They are the ones that shape a great deal of what your district has to do. Well, next comes the bilingual education, again responding to the immigration issues, largely in that sense, the inflow from Mexico and the Central American and the islands. Now, of course, in some states, it's seen as an evil thing. But bilingual ed, then Title IX, rights for women, that is often conceived to be just for sports, but of course it's not. I mean, if you read the law, if sports comes limping along, it's really about, in all phases of education, women should have equal position, resources, and so on. And then special ed. I was in the Pennsylvania Department of Education when that law came into existence. And if you take these things together, these actually changed schools. The civil rights legislation required schools to come to grips with special ed, with bilingual issues, with women's concerns, and the continuing lingering problem of the disadvantaged populations. And you live in that environment. And one of the failings, in my view, of the second thing we're going to talk about is there seems to be a notion that schools are like they were in the 50s. That is, that you don't have every day a bundle of challenges from the very diversity of your student population. And also, these have never been adequately paid for. The amount of money coming from the federal government to schools ranges from 7 to 9% of the total budget spent on education. 7 to 9%. But if you want any of that money, you have to conform to these laws. In my view, you ought to conform to these laws whether there's money or not, but that is a huge discussion. But I wanted to make it clear that in my view, this period of time was the fundamental transformation of the student bodies that we have to deal with in schools, and therefore the challenges to you and others became the profound challenges which in my view continue in many respects because of the resource distribution. And what I will do in a minute is ask you to think about, well, what are the current contexts and conditions that we ought to be responding to? But let me, and by the way, that leads Jimmy Carter to be the president from 76 to 80 to create a U.S. Department of Education and make it a cabinet level position. That's when the current, I mean, that's in most of our lifetimes, I think. So there it is. It's created, and there was a huge battle about that. A lot of us in education didn't want that to happen because it was embedded in the great health, education, and welfare budgets. And you could get more money, it was assumed, if you would connect it, because the unions backed that. And there was a big debate. I mean, I think Carter thought the education community was going to just love this to death. Well, they didn't. But it passed, and in retrospect, it's been a very good thing. All right. Well, then, let me go to this Nation at Risk, this document. So the Commissioner of Education, Terrell Bell, now we have the Department of Education, creates this National Commission on Excellence in Education. It's made up of educators. I want to make that point, because as we go forward here, educators begin to be part of the teams. I want to say that in this second phase, corporate America and the business interests actually begin to determine the course of things. Here, all educators, there was a retired guy from Bell Tele that was part of it, but it's all educators. Now, the charge to this group was to look at all phases of education, early childhood, elementary, secondary, higher ed, and determine what's going on, what do we need to do, what is an agenda for going forward. This document, I reread it just recently, thinking about this talk, and it is a really lovely and brilliantly written piece. It was written by a guy named Bruce Boston, who Scott probably knows because he goes on to be a constant writer for then MinC, now named your organization. And he also pops up as the writer later on for another piece that but he wrote this thing. What's important about it, he coins this expression. Anyway, it's a beautiful contextual discussion about all the factors I just talked about. What it doesn't do is really talk about them. It says, well, there we are, but what we're going to focus on is high schools. Well, a preponderance of the power in this were higher ed people. And, higher ed people really want high schools to do things because they're feeder systems. So they devoted themselves to high schools, and it's kind of spooky to read it because they describe the challenges. They say schools are failing, they're just awful. And they coin this expression, there's a rising tide of mediocrity in our education. Are you familiar with that? There was a New York Times piece about 2 months ago where somebody went on at great length about we have another rising tide of mediocrity. Well, for people of our era, my era, that's the old rallying call that was the beginning of the problem. And they do focus only on high school. And their solution was this, does this sound familiar? Make it more rigorous. Okay, make high school harder. Algebra 2, got to have it. And look, they believe in grades. I mean, people don't believe in grades that much. They want tougher college admission standards. Make it hard. Have standardized tests, but not by the federal government. Have an independent process at transition moments, and all the states should approve the textbooks. So it's a kind of an old-fashioned, in a sense, set of recommendations. But what happened was not too many people paid attention to the recommendations. What sprung up was an attitude that there's a rising tide of mediocrity, and schools are to blame for the woes, and teachers really need to be whipped into shape because schools are flawed and they're not going to cure themselves. And there's pessimism about the school's ability to improve. And this begins to perk in the business and corporate communities because there's a shift at this period away from, in my view, attention to the complexity of society, to the economic conditions of society. And the current standards movement is really all about our economy and the workforce. And so much of what happens in a theoretical way is a shift from education to training. That is, the goal of the standards era is to train people to be effective workers and be contributing to society. That even the new Common Core, which I want to talk about because I have great respect for that, have a set of standards for college and career. You're familiar with that. Well, I would put it college, career, and community, because if the outcomes of the learning for kids in schools should be to equip them for college and career, I want to equip them for community. So, the political rubric then, the rhetoric of the politics, and we're leading up to the election of George Bush. This is the Reagan period. The Reagan administration didn't have a whole lot of interest, really, in the education issues. They had other fish to fry. But the rhetoric in the society began to be driven by this mediocrity, and we got to fix schools. And so suddenly it becomes a big political issue. Now, Nation at Risk does make reference to goals and standards, but not with the same heft, and not certainly with the same meaning of standards, which have come, as you know, to be documents on paper. So let's see. Now, what happens after Nation at Risk? I think the well is poisoned. Schools are seen as flawed. Somebody's got to do something about this. This leads first President Bush to adopt education as a concern, and he's driven a lot here by the governors of the states who are grappling in their own states with these conditions that they have inherited in the budgets that have to be built to accommodate the new student populations and the other factors. They're stressed, and they begin to lead a concern about education. They have discussions with the president, and they convene. I'm going to do this real quick, these first couple, because then what I want to do, I want to come back to your life, and I want to talk about, okay, here's the scope of the standards movement. Now let's talk about what was going on with arts, okay? So I'm going to come to that in a minute, but I'll just give you a quick overview. So they meet, the Bush and the governors, and they come up with 6 goals for schools. Now, these are very broad societal goals. These are not curricular goals. There is mention of mathematics and there is mention of literacy, but I'll touch on them. They are not just limited to what you should know and be able to do in physics. I mean, we're talking about very big goals. And they create a national goals panel. Now, this panel continues in existence until No Child Left Behind. And it goes about its work in a very sophisticated way. It's a very interesting body. It changes its composition over time, adding various new players to it, including members of Congress at some point in time. Well, when you look back at it historically, it actually did very good work. And it took on the goals. It took on early childhood. It took on safe and free and disciplined schools. It took on adult literacy. It took on drug addictions and other forms of addiction. It tackled the questions of the curriculum in dealing with mathematics, and it took on the issue of measurement and assessment, but in a very profound way, recognizing that there are multiple forms of assessment, and we got to figure out what to do. And so here you had a national goals panel that actually, in my view, was addressing the broad agenda, almost as broad as it should have been. And they continued having meetings and discussions and committee meetings around the country and issuing reports. If you go into the website of this, you can go back and read all the reports, and you would say to yourself, whoa, it would have been nice if they'd paid attention to some of that. But what happens is, it really is superseded by a next wave. What I want to talk about, too, just for a second, is about this time, a report, SCANS report, the Secretary's Commission on the Necessary Skills, the Secretary of Labor, And it's interviews with corporate, and it's an analysis of what corporate and business says are the skills that are needed for the, so we're beginning to focus, aren't we, on, it's all about manpower, it's all about business and corporate needs, it's all about that. And the interesting thing about that list, it becomes a list of terms that over time are refined and built on, and they become the 21st century skill list. Now, you are familiar with the 21st century skills. Even the lingo, right? Everybody talks 21st century skills. Well, there's a list, that's been developed by the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, and it continues that. It's a very good piece of work. And I want to say this, and I'll come back to it. It really electrifies the arts community because it calls for things like critical thinking, critical judgment. I prefer critical judgment, by the way. I think that's the skill we want. Critical thinking can be carping. Critical judgment is the capacity to know quality and to determine. And I'm convinced that the arts are one of the fundamental ways to develop critical judgment. But it also has persistence. It has, the ability to stick to things. I mean, it has a mix of what's really needed to do a job. And the arts people, and I really was clear about it, we do that. We do that. So that was a very important report, and the arts community began to use it. Then the Congress adopts the Council on Education Standards and Testing, okay? And we begin then to get a little narrower, but the Elementary and Secondary Education Act then passed in 1994, establishes, and this is the 2000, Goals 2000. Do you remember that? Goals 2000 was the federal law. And they have 8 broad goals, but again, they're this very broad. The law does not have assessment testing as its crucial piece. It is a much more mixed and I think sensitive to the complexity of schools approach. But it does call for national voluntary standards in the disciplines. I'm going to come back to that. What I'm going to do is go a quick overview, and then I'm going to come back and plug in the arts at these crucial moments. Because this is the period where the arts shine as a powerful advocacy collective. You and your discipline with your colleague educators, the arts world in general, it begins in this period of time to use your muscle power. And you bring about certain goods as much as we could. And that's where we always started talking about what should students know and be able to do, which I think is a really beautiful expression of what we're after. What should they know and be able to do? And one of the nice things about the new Common Core is because of Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins, their great work, they flip it and they say, well, you got to start with what do you want them to do? Then you figure out what do they need to learn. That is, you put performance first. And in the Goals 2000, they create the 21st Century Learning Centers around the country, which are the after school. So this is an interesting law. This is Dick Riley's the Secretary of Education at this time, and his staff, and including his special assistant Terry. Gordon, I blocked his name. Scott and Terry Peterson, together with Gordon and colleagues at the Council of Chief State School Officers, they see the federal role not as a very sort of narrowly focused, but as a general creation of a set of programs and processes in the states that will address the range, and so they embrace early childhood and other things. Now, what they do require is that every state create a master plan to get the federal money. But the states design the master plan, and that's where the arts also slip into the thing, and we'll come back to that. Now, here's what happens, though. There's restlessness in the business community and the corporate community that things are not going as well as they should. I mean, the changes they want to see. And the Goals panel actually invites the National Alliance of Business and the Chief State School Officers to have another gathering. Now, in my view, it's taken over by the corporate community. It's when Lou Gerstner is the chief executive officer of IBM, a powerhouse of a guy. And I happen to be, my offices were then in the Council of Chief State School Officers. There was a tremendous effort on the part of the education community, and certainly on the part of the arts community, to have a role in the discussions and the outcomes of that convening. And it was hard to do. It was really a corporate power-driven. Out of it was created the organization called Achieve, which is funded by corporate and philanthropic dollars. And Achieve has carried forward the banner of, in my view, a certain form of curriculum and a certain form of assessment. Now, the President of the United States was not there. Notice that Bush does one. Clinton starts, Clinton's the president. He's invited to sort of show up and say things and go away. And a very small group of educators on balance are there or have power. And I know we couldn't get anybody from the arts to it. And they really beat the drum for you got to get really down to standardized testing and measurement in a very specific standards. My view is this is an engineer's view. That is, the standards movement, as it then is driven to be, has an engineer's concept in mind. That is, you have to have very specific measurements of the quality and the potential of whatever you're going to undertake. And so the word standards moves from being a general concept of excellence, so, you know, a standard for a musician, you know, might be a great trombonist. Ruben's helping me out up here. Your standard might be the great performer in your field. That is, that's the standard. How do you move toward that level of quality? Standards to me are performance-based. That is, you look to what you want. I look to Fred Astaire, and I can't dance worth a hoot, but as a kid, so standards are more viable, more rich in meaning, and they are about performance, and they have to be measured by performance. But the standards begin to drift toward narrow measurement, standardized measurement, testing that goes to certain specifics. I don't want to denigrate assessment. I'm just saying that the goals and standards envisioned have to be richer, and I think Common Core is coming to that. Well, then we get, of course, with Bush 2, No Child Left Behind, which you're still living with, right? And this is, I think, generally the view that this really, on balance, was bad. There were good things in that law because it did continue to want to identify minority populations that were failing and demand that they get richer attention. I think that intention carried forward the general notion of the federal law to deal with disadvantaged populations and special populations that are in great need. That concept is in the law. It's the means of doing it that we've all had trouble with, and that is the rise of standardized testing, accountability, the annual yearly progress, and those things and the highly qualified teaching. Well, then we have the Obama administration, which after a little bit begins to waive some of the requirements of No Child. And as you know, No Child, that law should have been reauthorized twice since 2000. It's supposed to be reauthorized every 4 years. And they do that, and they just change its name and reshape it. Well, as you may know, Congress just recently has decided maybe they'll try and do something, and there's some activity in the Senate. But generally, its residue is still out there with you, the testing requirements and some, but a lot of the states are getting waivers from No Child Left Behind because the Obama administration is going with Race to the Top, which, as you know, is a competitive grants program that the states had to draw up a plan and compete. There were 2 awards in the first year, which I thought was really odd. But little by little, states are doing, and that strategy is to have a competitive program where the states promise the moon and get really big money. But the moon that they have to promise is not without its own problems, including how do you do teacher evaluation using test data, and what are the tests to do that. So there's still, even within that, kind of the life you're living with out there. But we are in at least a conversation about whether what has been building up across the standards period and No Child Left Behind, whether in fact that should be retained. And so the waivers. Now, up to the present. But let's go back and I'll touch on it. And here's what happens with the arts folks. Remember when the National Council of Education Standards adopted, this is voluntary. They say we ought to have disciplines. Well, MinC, you're now named, isn't it? You've changed your name? What? Oh, no fame. Wait a minute. No, you got to work with that. So MinC takes the lead. You've always, the music field has often taken the lead. First of all, you're in that kind of mode. You know, musicians manage things, ensembles, chorals. I mean, I think there's something built into those of you who manage those. I mean, so the music people, and besides, you're the largest. So you take the lead and you say, well, look, we'll help create the standards. Now I'm talking about the standards of that period. And they go together with the visual arts, with dance and theater, and they create the standards that probably in your state are the standards that have been modified at the state level, but generally the framework for those standards, which included, of course, performance, but included knowing the history of your form, having an insight into the cultural context of that, and having the ability to make quality judgments, that is, aesthetic judgments. And all four forms agree to use that matrix to build the standards. Well, to my view, that was an incredibly pivotal moment for you folks and your colleagues, because it's when all of the art forms said, we are in this together, we need to think about arts and what is learning in the arts, what should students be able to know and do in the arts and in our specific, and how can we describe that process across the four forms? And that, to me, was a really crucial moment. And you go forward with that. What they do is, you articulate knowledge, skills, and understandings they have to have in each of the forms. And you publish this in 1994. Now, remember, that's at the beginning of the Goals 2000 period, which calls for, in the law, the states to adopt standards, primarily, of course, in literacy and mathematics, but the call is out there, and the standards that you folks have put together become those standards. And so the arts are out of the box. There's the mathematics people always say, no, we did it first. Well, but the one that really took were your standards that you developed collectively, and that's been the model for the states. What happens then is, as the law, the Goals 2000 law, is emerging, the arts aren't immediately mentioned. There was a battle, by the way, to get the arts into the previous goal discussions, and that worked pretty well. But this is the law now. And one of the achievements of the arts community was to include in the definition of the third goal, that's actually the third goal. All students will leave those grades having demonstrated competent, and it names the subjects. Well, when it first came out, it didn't name the arts. And so your community, the arts community, broadly worked to get the arts put into that law, and it got put into the law. And that, frankly, is a very significant achievement. And what then happens is that the arts community, you folks, the teachers, the educators, but colleagues in other dimensions from the university, from the arts organizations, begin to collaborate together to look at what is emerging in national and state policy, and how can we make sure that the arts are not off the table? And that has been your achievement now for this whole period, and it is mushroomed into a really significant achievement with the Common Core. But let's just quickly look at this. In 1995, the federal government, Dick Roddy is the secretary, the National Endowment for the Arts, Jane Alexander is the chair of the endowment, together with Gordon at the Council of Chief State School Officers and the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, after an extensive series of meetings around the country with a broad range of people, Dick and Jane, I always liked that, Dick and Jane, they wrote this little primer for what should happen. They challenged the arts community and said, look, we're putting this law together. It's an opportunity. We're pro-arts, and they were pro-arts. The Clintons were pro-arts, and they were pro-arts. We're putting this together. Why don't you people get your act together and collaborate across the disciplines and across the in-school and out-of-school? There were 140 organizations that met for a period of time, and the organizations drew this plan up and said, yes, we'll do that, but we need an organization that'll keep it all together. Well, those four entities, the two federal agencies, the Council of Chief State School Officers, and the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, went together and said, we'll create the organization that'll run this for you, and I was hired to run it. But what happens here is, I want to dwell on the word partnership for a moment, and because tomorrow David Myers is going to talk about partnership and its crucial importance to you and to the field. But the thing is called a partnership, and that's in fact what it was. And among the other things that we did was to focus on research. And over the period of time, as you may or may not know, published a great body of research, did compendiums of other people's research, looking at the impact of the arts on the cognitive and personal development of young people. You have a vast body of research in music on how to teach music. What we were looking at is what happens to the kid. And so we did a lot of research on the kid, the school, and so on, and it became an important period of time. Well, when this is the meeting where the corporate folks, in my judgment, begin to take over. We worked hard to try and get into that discussion, and this is where Bruce Boston again comes into play, and we drafted all kinds of things. And we just didn't have any luck. I mean, we just weren't at the table for that. And that's where, in my judgment, there was this additional swing toward a narrow specificity. And if we had been at the table, along with other prominent educators, it might not have gone that way. Then this very interesting things happened. The National Assessment for Educational Progress had been around for a long time. The goals panel had recognized it and said they ought to be the ones that should figure out how to do these assessments about the goals. But they had done a rinky-dink little study of the arts years ago in the 70s. But now they were going to do a full-blown national assessment of the arts. And that also then, you and your colleagues, and Scott was very active, began helping put that together. They began determining what it should measure. And then, with the help of Gordon and the Council of Chief State School Officers, you had to write a document as to what did we want to have measured in this assessment, and it wrote what was called the conceptual framework. In my judgment, that document, with the new document, the new conceptual, are the most powerful articulations of the arts that there are. This was an amazingly wonderful document, and when I was being hired to run AEP, I read that document and I said, this is inspirational. And it was a real guidance to it. Now, I don't know whether you even know about it or heard about it, but it also discusses, again, trying to search across the domains, across the disciplines. It comes up with responding, performing, creating. Now, the visual people bailed out on performing, and so they just went with, it was a funny thing. But at any rate, that language, where all of the arts community agree, that's what we're up to. We're up to getting kids to respond comprehensively and significantly and with insight into art, and we're getting them to perform it, and we're getting to be creative in the process. They were in my view, they are absolutely profound and powerful terms. Fortunately, they're being carried forward into the Common Core. But that was a unique moment. That document and the work and the discussions, the conversation that went into it were fabulous. Now, there was an assessment, and it was done in the 8th grade. You couldn't do it for dance because there weren't enough programs. There was a small study there. There was a little bit on drama, but since music and visual arts are the present, throughout school, you could do it in those two fields. It was flawed in some respects, but what I always argued, and we ended up at AEP and with some of your colleagues, helping Dick Riley think about how to release the thing, and we ran a big video program across the United States. What it demonstrated, by the way, is there was a correlation between students that did well on the responding and who did well in creativity. Well, this is a duh. I mean, of course, if you prepare them to respond with depth to a visual object, to a piece of music, of course they're going to be more creative. I mean, you have to know something to be creative. You have to have a grasp on not just your techniques, but on the purposes of why you're doing this. So I thought that the report had significance, but it was a benchmark for your field, for the language of your field, and for the comprehensive agreement, and that has been sustained. Well, then comes No Child, and I needn't tell you what's happened there. But the bottom point is the one. The only way that could be deal with the implications of No Child Left Behind really was to create partnerships in and across the disciplines, in and across the schools, in and across the world inside the school and the world outside the school. And by the way, we once again had to get the arts back into the law. That took some heavy lifting, but it was put into the law, and it was put in the front of the law, called the General Education, where it defines when the word core subject appears anywhere else in this law, here's what it means. It's sort of the lexicon. Well, we got the arts into that part of the law, so that anytime, and I'll give you a precise example, anytime in Title I, it says federal dollars can be spent on the core subjects. That includes the arts. We then proceeded. We had allies, of course, in the Clinton administration, but we continued. We got the head of the federal Title I office to issue a letter each year that we posted on our website saying, folks, you can spend Title I money on the arts. Now, those of you who work in districts where the Title I is its own sort of empire, with its own long history, of remedial support reading, you have a hard time convincing people that that's true, but it is true, and that carried through. So we considered that, and the field considered that a really major accomplishment on the part of the arts to get that into the law. Now, I want to ask the question then, are we in a new era? That's what we've been living with. Are we new, and is there a new definition arising about school reform? I hope so. I hope so. My own hope is I hope we go to where we begin to think again about, well, what are the conditions in society, in the United States and globally, that we need good performance from the young people to respond to? I mean, that to me is the fundamental question. And you might want to, and I take, a couple of things that have happened here, really, I think in this case, the CCSSO, the Concert Chief State School Officers, they actually took the lead on the Common Core. They led that effort. They went together with the National Governors Association. This was not a corporate pressure. These were the educators saying, we have got to do something about the fact that there's so much differential learning in the states where you can't tell from state to state whether, in fact, kids learning to read means the same thing. We've got to get that straightened out, and the educators have taken the lead on insisting on Common Cores. I think 45 states has now adopted these voluntary common in mathematics, in language arts and mathematics. And for the arts community, the College Board weighs in. Now, we had a lot of struggle with the College Board, and I have to tell you, the critical arts group that was instrumental in getting the College Board to say, yeah, we got this thing, was the dance community. There were members on the advisory committee to the College Board from the dance community, and they were tenacious. And finally, the College Board ran this big meeting. It was in, I think I had just retired, a big meeting. And they asked everybody, what should we do? And they said, you have got to do something about the arts in general. Yes, you've got to do dance and maybe get an AP in the dance and testing, assessment in the dance. But you got to do something. Well, I was astonished, frankly, because I've been retired now a couple of years, to begin to see what the College Board has done, with assembling all the research, leading the charge. And the nice thing about that is, as you know, the College Board is an association of universities and colleges. I mean, it's a big crowd of people. So one of the things that's often absent from the reform is higher ed. It's a little bit odd to me, by the way. Higher ed, all of us have been trained for higher ed to teach. Okay. Well, then people are upset with the schools, and they say teachers are in terrible condition. Well, I would say, well, higher ed, you trained us all. If we're so awful, shouldn't you do something about it? But they tend not to be as energetically involved as I think they should be. Be that as it may, this is a big deal that the College Board got involved here. And I mentioned to Michael, you must read the conceptual framework document that emerged from the incredible series of discussions that went on with you, and Scott Schuler played a crucial role on your behalf, your colleagues did. All of the arts disciplines participated in an extensive trying to build these new common core standards in the arts, which will replace the standards you guys put together a number of years ago. I am really impressed with the conceptual document, and frankly, its adoption, if I may say so, if you know the work of Jay McTighe and Grant Wiggins, who have really transformed a lot of the thinking through their Understanding by Design books, figure out what you want to have done at the end and work backward. It just is profound work. And this conceptual document, I think you ought to read. In fact, McTighe and Wiggins just put out 5 big questions about the Common Core, and one of them is, please read the conceptual framework so you know what we're trying to do here. Now, the actual standards in the music and the other forms are still in development. I continue to chair the advisory committee to the Maryland State Board of Education, and so for 15 years I've been doing that. And so I watch this, and I have some role in sort of helping that department respond to things emerging. The actual content of the are still secret. They're trying to sort of develop them in such a way that they don't wound too many people before they do self-correction. I think it's the way to put it. But they're looking very, very good. And I saw data just the day before yesterday, Friday, that you had feedback from constituencies around the country, and people were really very, very pleased, the music people and the visual arts people who responded more than the others. Very pleased with the new shaping of those. Well, okay, but let me end here. Here are some questions, though. Will these individual disciplines in music and visual arts, will they actually match the expectations of the conceptual framework? You might, Scott will probably go into some. I mean, it's a stretch. It really is a stretch. It's really all about the kids, the relevance of everything to the kids' learning in multiple ways. Whoop, didn't mean to do that. Well, look, will there be teachers around to teach it? right? I mean, look, I mean, you know, you can do all this, and will you be there? Will you be supported? Will your colleagues will be able to hire more teachers? So the usual big question. And will the assessments that have to be developed, both for the language arts and the mathematics, because that's still, there are 29 states that are in a consortium to create those assessments, and the last I checked, they're sort of still trying to figure them out. Will the performance the assessments in the arts will be performance-based. I mean, your field and the other, they'll just insist on it. But the question is, will anybody adopt them? Then, and here I want to then drift back to this contextual thing. Will schools be structured appropriate to the task? Notice that in this period of time, the standards, it's all about kids and teachers. Well, it should be. But somebody ought to take a look at the schools. That is, the physical structures of the schools. Do you have a dance floor? You know, I mean, if you see what I'm saying, this drive toward the narrow approach about the student learning and student outcomes being assessed, which is profound and crucial. But you got the rest of the issues that we haven't grappled with. What do you do with with special ed kids on some of these issues? I mean, what if the kids are dropping out and don't show up for school? What about in urban areas that are underfunded? I mean, you have the whole array of, remember, I don't mean to remember, when the standards were adopted, the national voluntary standards, the content standards were adopted, but there was another set of standards developed. They were called the conditions of success. Your field built another. Okay, look, here are the content and performance outcomes. But if you want that, you got to do this. They were never honored, and they were things like have teachers, right? Have a music room, have instruments. Those conditions, that set of goals were never adopted, were never admitted to, actually. And then the final one. Will schools be allowed and supported in responding to today's critical concerns? Well, so I want to sort of come back to you on this. What are the critical concerns today? What are they? Some of them linger from the 60s. We still have diverse populations, linguistic challenges. We still have great disparity in wealth. We have a lot of the 60s and 70s issues, and we have new ones. I mean, the whole cyberspace worlds, kids learning more outside of school than they learn in school is the claim. I don't believe it, but certainly they're doing a lot of things outside of school that, and the advances in the science. Out of that arising, by the way, the STEM, the science, technology, engineering. I years ago said put A in that, put STEAM in your STEM if you wanted to succeed. And I did that at a conference, NEA, National Education Association conference. I was stunned. John Wilson was the executive director. I thought it was cute. He said, you got to go with that. And so suddenly I find that people are saying STEAM, not STEM. And I actually think that's right. But the interesting relationship between sciences and the arts. Now, that's the nice thing about the Common Core. They demand interdisciplinary relationships. They absolutely demand it. And they demand it in a really profound way. Not just the arts ones, but the other ones. And so we're spending a lot of time in Maryland as you map out the new arts stand, looking and correlating them to the literacy content. And the interesting thing is they've stopped asking us to teach arts so that people will read. They actually are asking us to define literacy in the arts, which is so that musical notation, lyrics, all forms of literacy, they are beginning to recognize, and they, College Board and others, they're beginning to realize that that literacy is a symbolic system, and every art form has its own symbolic system. And the more you know about those symbolic systems, the more you can do the other ones. So the better you can read music and sing and do all that, the better you read. So, there's a very, very fascinating set of developments. There's inclusive, and I want to come to the last one because, the schools are going to have to be helped to deal with religious, cultural, and other kinds of conflicts. Just take the thing about bullying. Everywhere I go, and people are gripping. Well, these are society conditions. I'm sort of interested as you grapple with the question of what do we mean when we say school reform? What do you mean? How is it being used in the world at large? And what should it be? What should it be? Do we really need to reconfigure the school, certainly the high schools, school buildings? I mean, how should we grapple with the technology possibilities? To me, I actually don't like the word reform. It seems to me it's a funny word. It has the connotation that when I was doing practice teaching back in the early 60s, I taught in what was called a reform school. It means you had bad kids in there, and they had to be reformed. Well, I mean, some phases of school reform treat the schools as like bad kids, and they just got to be reformed. And damn it, you got to do it this way, and you got to bash them. I don't like the word, and it seems to me what we really want to know is the more general question: what are we trying? What are the purposes of schools at this in 2013 and beyond? What do we have to help kids be able to learn and do to make a contribution to that world, both as personally fulfilled human beings, but also as good citizens, as good workers, as imaginative, creative, innovative? That, to me, is what we want to look for in the schools. You will find it in many, many schools. You will find it if you look for it. There are areas where you don't find it, and we have to help. We have to help the schools make that happen. And that, to me, is the challenge. How do we begin to be helpful toward the schools and toward you and your colleague teachers to address the real conditions in society? You have two challenges. You have to do your own work extraordinarily well, which you do. You're distinguished at it. And the new standards to look at you're doing that as a collective group are I think, going to be quite wonderful. That gives you guidance, but you have to do it, and you have to do it very, very well. But in doing that very, very well, which is your main, how does that relate to the larger purpose? Is there any relationship between what you're doing and dealing with religious challenges, with diversity in our society, with global knowledge, with the challenges of the social networks? That's a different kind of issue, but one I invite you to have in mind as you develop and do your own work. And surely you do it. But to me, that's what we want schools to be. And so, how will you respond? That's it. Okay.
For a few minutes.
Oh, yeah.
Questions and discussion?
Sure. If you have questions or comments, I'll ask Gordon to answer them for you. But any comments, questions, I'd be happy to field them. And what looms is break. So just the break time looms. So, Scott, you got any words of wisdom you want to? Yeah, was that somebody in the back? A brave soul, perhaps? No brave souls.
Well, I'll be a brave soul.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Joe Saletta. I work in public schools. And I feel the issues that I'm dealing with as a teacher, I do instrumental music with students, and I'm also doing general music. And I feel that, and I know I'm not alone in this, that one of the major issues is the interruption of the educational process by students who are challenged with behavioral issues, whether it be some acronym of ADHD or not necessarily poverty-based, because I have students who come from low-income families and they're very well behaved. So that's a reflection of the family. But how do we as educators deal with these challenges every day when that interruption of the process of education occurs? It should be handled within the school in some way and by some support staff. But I feel that's a real concern in today's education.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody want to respond to that? Yeah.
The data just
Scott, talk in there because they're recording this.
Data were just released in the state of Connecticut that's under discussion now on the differential rate of expulsion among charter schools as compared to regular public schools. And what's coming out around the country is a number of these schools where there really isn't solid data to support that they outperform regular public schools anyway. A number of these schools achieve their results in part by taking students that they don't want and giving them back to the regular public schools. So this problem is one that the public schools are struggling to deal with, and others don't want to handle the same kinds of problems. So this is a continuing issue for teachers, and this notion of full inclusion taken to its illogical end results in classes that become unteachable and students who suffer from having to put up with the behavior of other students in that same classroom.
Yeah, what you're dealing with is a societal challenge, isn't it? Because the behavior of those kids you inherit. And why are they behaving that way? And that has to do with the social context in which they're being raised. I mean, we've known this for years. That's why I get troubled when there's an expectation that schools can fix that and that you're blamed if you don't. I mean, we really do need a national leadership, a state leadership, a district leadership that tries to think through what are the conditions in our communities from which children have behavioral issues that are controllable. I mean, some of the things you cited, these are children with certain kinds of difficulties. But it goes to my point, I'm not going to offer you a solution. It goes to my point that in a narrow approach to what should be going on in schools and a blaming of teachers for not having every child succeed on testing overlooks the fact that there are so many factors you can't control. Now brilliant, powerful, passionate speakers from the communities of poverty say, don't tell me that, it's your job, you take care of it. Well, they have a bit of a point if the school as a whole and the community as a whole joins with you. It sort of is offensive to convert it into you're failing your job as a teacher if you can't handle 52 kids squirming around and some of them throwing things at one another. And so a reform of schools should be a reform of community. And that's why national leadership, state leadership, political leadership should be seeking, and they are in their own way, seeking ways to stabilize and improve community life. Otherwise, schools will not be able to be the sole institution fulfilling all those challenges. So, and of course, there's the other factor close at hand. You need a principal that's aware of those conditions and is your voice to the people above and a voice to the community. But I don't have a specific solution. I just want to pass on to you that you're not alone. That's for sure. Yes, sir.
Early on, you discussed goals of education very broadly that were kind of developed in the 50s, 60s. And one of those was a fulfilled personal life.
Yeah.
I believe the corporate influences of the late 90s and the early 2000s have changed the set of goals, have redefined the purpose of education to eliminate fulfilled personal life, at least in my classes, in my school district, in my region. That doesn't seem to be a goal anymore when people talk about why we have schools, what education is about. I think one of our responses might need to be to redefine our goals.
Well, I agree with you. Could you hear? His comment was he felt that I was blaming corporate, and so he just called that the general, economic forces, corporate and business, are really are leading to a definition of what we want to have happen with kids in schools, to not be their personal fulfillment as human beings, but to be trained, to play a role as defined by the economic needs of society and not the social needs of society. And I'm afraid that's what my feeling is. Now, fortunately, you folks are at work, and others, your colleagues. A lot of teachers, particularly that are passionate about their work, whether it's music or physics or English, teachers who are passionate about their work always see their work as a crucial dimension of development for the young person. To do poetry, to do a physics lab, to do math. So teachers are really the ones that carry the notion that what I'm teaching you is personal, and it's fulfilling for you. And you will be a good person and a fulfilled person. And look what you'll be able to do. You'll be able to be a good citizen and so on and so forth. So in one sense, that's my concern, that the overarching concepts are about deliver unto me the trained human being so I can run my business. It brings back to me when we were going to Japan I guess I was in the early 80s, because it was very interesting to talk to the corporate players in Japan. They actually didn't want the kids to go to high school. They wanted them to go to sort of the end of a period of time, call it 8th grade, and then come into the corporations and they'd train them. We went over thinking that there were these wonderful things going on we'd learn from. And you did learn some things as you looked later on at their methods of teaching mathematics and so on. But generally it was a surprise. I may have talked myself into a falsity that maybe that's part of Japan's problem today. But I don't want to go that far. But anyway, it was interesting. So I take your point. Maintain your passion. Yes, please.
One thing that struck me, you were talking about the possible golden age would have been in the 50s, but then the subsequent recession in the 70s. And then I've only been a teacher in New York for 6 years, but it seems to me that it is a very bountiful music program and arts program in this town. And most of us have very supportive principals, and most of us have really fantastic things happening in our schools. And I'm wondering if you see that kind of thing is on the rise in the nation, or that this district is not, I wouldn't say alone, but in the minority, or do you see this kind of thing happening in more and more places, in more and more urban places in the U.S.?
Well, thank you, and good for you, by the way. Actually, my own view is that there is a rising tide, not a mediocrity, but a rising tide of understanding in the public at large of the value of what you and I call the arts. The last thing I was doing before I retired, we began doing a series of national opinion polling, because it was right before the Obama first election. And we were curious about, was there support in the American people for the role of imagination in society as it was then fulfilled through the arts? And there was a long background as to why we did this. But we were also doing it anticipating the national elections. Well, we really found, to our surprise, because we had done national polling when the 97 assessment results, we did national polling to say, how should we publish this stuff? We found then, by the way, and this came as a great shock to a lot of people, that the American public didn't like the word creativity. They thought it was kind of a weird thing. There were weird people that did that. This was true. This was in 97. So when we were dealing with Dick Rowley, we said, Dick, this is kind of an interesting thing here. And we had to work around that. And so 10, 15 years later, we discovered that there was enormous support for the role of imagination. People actually, with a little bit of prompting, can realize they are imaginative. They can go to cook at night and suddenly there's not what they thought and they just make something up. People can be convinced, yeah, I do have an imagination. I wish it were better. I wish it could be developed. And yeah, sure, the best thing to do that is something you would call arts, you and I would call arts. They would call, just learning to cook better, or learning to build furniture, or learning to, paint. They have, and so what we began to find was their support We asked questions, and 93% of the respondents said art should be in the schools. So we took that information to Congress and to the education committees of Congress, and we brought in, we had a lot of high-powered people doing the polling. I mean, this was not rinky-dink. And we actually tried to brief all the presidential candidates. Remember, at that time, there were a flock of Republicans running, and Hillary and Obama. And so we couldn't get, so we sent it all to them. And my contention always was that imagination is hope. I think I had a class. Anyway, I won't elaborate because you've got to throw me off the stage. So to your point, I do believe, and I must say that the recent growth in cognitive psychology and in neuroscience, I heard Eric Kandel talk the other day, the great neuroscience. I mean, I think this, the capacity of the imagination, innovation and creativity, and its crucial role in life and in work, is taking hold. What we're not yet able to do is to convert that into policy. And my view is that the problem is those defining the policy in legislative context are driven by another kind of agenda. And I do believe, without demeaning, they're driven by the economic necessities. I mean, they think workforce is the answer. But I've noticed, I live in Maryland, I work in Maryland, and I am really pleased with the public support. Now, money gets to be the problem, right? Are the resources sufficient? But that's why I say, is there a new era possible? Are we really at a point where maybe this Common Core discussion, maybe the sheer burden of the problems of society today, including the economic problems, global problems, religious disputes, I mean, the growth of a kind of strange conservatism. Maybe there's a hope that we can, in fact, develop a new national discourse around important values. See, my argument has always been to the arts community, come in behind. That is, don't go first saying we're the transcendent saviors. Come in behind saying, look, what are people searching for? What are we hoping to have done? Then let us show you how we can help. And that was our whole advocacy effort throughout the 90s. Look how the arts can help address issues. And we bought into the economic discussion, remember, because we showed all the power that the arts have to make somebody. We bought into that because it was the context. A lot of people got upset about that. That's instrumental. I want to be intrinsic. But you just have to see your role not only to be great at what you do, that's first, but secondly, how that fits a community and social need. And is there a community and social need specific in your region that becomes your point of focus? Well, there's no alternative, there's no alternative to hope, right? I mean, despair is a luxury.
I like that. Well, thank you, Dick, for giving us a good start, framing the history in a general term. We're going to, and thank you for doing that, and I especially like your ending of hope as opposed to despair, which is actually an important aspect of what we were talking about when we want to talk about over these 2 days, is hope and change and the role that all of you can play in that, making sure that our discipline is active and flourishing.